The next panel is composed of ministers of foreign affairs and of climate and environment. The guests will explore the possible scenarios and the strategic outcomes of the war in Ukraine. Which scenario may bring lasting peace for Europe? What are the risks, benefits, and costs of the alternative outcomes? Our guests are, in ABC order, Pekka Haavisto, former Minister of Foreign Affairs in Finland, former Minister of the Environment, former Minister of International Development, a Member of Parliament, and a 3-time presidential candidate. Did I get the list right? I'd like to welcome to the stage Géza Jeszenszky, former Minister of Foreign Affairs in Hungary, former Ambassador of Hungary to the United States, former Ambassador of Hungary to Norway and Iceland. And last but not least, Michał Kurtyka, former Minister of Climate and Environment in Poland. He's a distinguished fellow at the Atlantic Council. And the moderator is Olga Khakova, Deputy Director for the European Energy Security at the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center. The floor is yours. Good to have you.
Thank you so much for the kind introductions and welcome, ministers. This is quite a fantastic panel we have today. I applaud all of you. I know this is the end of the day, so it's incredible to see the audience still being full, and I believe this will be a riveting discussion, so I'm glad that you're here for it. We will dive right in. My first question is, this is a panel about scenarios. We are over 2.5 years into this horrific full-scale invasion. Thousands of people misplaced, millions misplaced, thousands of people either hurt or kidnapped or tortured. And we're also seeing cases of children being stolen from Ukraine, being kidnapped. A really challenging situation, and it's spilling over into Europe, and a lot of countries are feeling the impacts at home, from the energy implications to economic implications to just the broader impacts of migration, an extremely challenging situation. So I think we're in a pretty good understanding of where we are right now. But walk us through of what is, from here on, what is the worst case scenario and what is the best case scenario considering how the war will develop. So we'll start with Mr. Haavisto, if you don't mind.
Well, not an easy task. First of all, great to be here, and thanks for organizers. This has been a great conference, and very, very interesting topics have been discussed. But let me first maybe start by saying that many things already has changed. Not only Russia's attack against Ukraine, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but also Europe has already changed. I'm thinking about the European Union, which reacted very rapidly through the European Peace Facility to start to give military aid to Ukraine. I remember the first calls from Helsinki as a foreign minister to Stockholm and Norway, saying that we have been planning to start to give weapons to Ukraine. And the Swedish minister, after a long silence, said that we gave last time weapons to anyone in conflict 1939 to Finland, when the Winter War broke up and Russia attacked Finland. So is it time to give the military aid again? And we did that, all Nordic countries, but also all European countries. We also have had the NATO enlargement, something that you could not imagine that it could happen in such a rapid time. Again, I have to say that when we had our first calls saying that Finland is planning to join NATO, there were many who responded that, well, don't do that in the middle of conflict, the peace will come soon, it's negotiations, don't shake the situation. But of course, in weeks and months, we noticed that it was a very timely decision. We also again called to Sweden, and the answer was that Sweden has been neutral for 200 years, don't even dream that we could join. And then 1 week afterwards, there was some rethinking that it's maybe time for Finland and Sweden to join again. I, by the way, today met with Peter Siarto in his office, and of course we had a during our NATO accession, a long process also with Hungary, which then luckily ended well. We have a diversification of energy supplies. From Finnish point of view, Mr. Leskelä has already told what we have done with the gas, with the oil, with our dependency on Russian energy, and we are not the only one. This has been actually making the green transition much more rapid in the whole Europe. It's a major change. We will never be again so dependent on Russian energy as we were before. We have also been ready to meet all kinds of harassment from the Russian side. In Finland, of course, we calculated what could be the big harassment: airspace, violating of airspace, violating of maritime areas, even land areas, and what could be the small-scale harassment, like a GPS signal disturbance and things like that. And we have been, of course, seen that, and we have had our response to that. Unfortunately, we have also seen at the Baltic Sea not only the Nord Stream explosion, but also the violation of the Baltic connector between Finland and Estonia, which was a major incident against our energy networks. And when we are thinking about, I'm still thinking about this topic of today, Europe under siege, where should I pay more attention? I would actually look more what's happening in the Northern Africa with the Sahel region, where Europe is losing a little bit its influence. We see Wagner troops in several Sahel countries. I would look more Middle East. I would look also what's happening. Of course, Belarus feels almost like a lost case in many ways with President Lukashenko, but I would look very carefully what's happening in Moldova, what's happening in Serbia, what's happening in Georgia and so forth, where we really have to have a European influence during these days. And then maybe to your question, some kind of answer, when you think about the peace, which will hopefully come one day. Of course, it's very much about the land areas, hopefully Ukraine getting back the control of Donbas and Crimea. It's about the compensation of the damage done by Russia. Hopefully some of those freezed assets, which are freezed by the West, could then compensate the loss that Ukraine has been suffering. It's about the security guarantees, what kind of security guarantees we can arrange to Ukraine. I can see both the EU accession of Ukraine and the NATO accession of Ukraine as part of those security guarantees. And of course, hopefully, all this will mean also political changes in Moscow, in Russia, a lesson learned from the Russian side on this issue. And my feeling is, actually, there are many people who ask, why didn't we react 2014 when the Crimean occupation was there? And I'm always asking myself, where was the front? We saw these unrecognized soldiers marching to Crimea. We saw vessels changing their flags. We didn't hear or see any invitation of Western countries or neighbors to come to the help of the Ukraine fighting against Russia. But we did. What happened in spring 22, there was an immediate question for us to help, and we did that. We mobilized our resources to fight for Ukraine. So I'm thinking also one lesson learned, that Ukraine itself has changed in this process to a country which is more united and which is ready to defend itself.
Thank you so much, Mr. Jeszenszky. Worst case and best case scenario from where we are today.
Me? Oh, sorry. Well, my profession is history, and a historian should decline to say something or to make predictions about the future. And here we are to make predictions. But having been involved in politics during the great changes, I think, yes, we have a view. We have not only hopes, but we can make some guesses, perhaps guesses which we hopefully may become true. Well, a few minutes ago, we just listened to President Valenza. And I think if there is any lesson from this conference, and in fact, a lesson what we should have drawn since Putin launched this war, is what the former president said. And of course, so many people said, need for common policies, solidarność, solidarity, and to be determined, and not to allow the bad memories to prevail. The bad memories are what the world, how the world reacted to Nazism and to Stalinism, appeasement. And actually, appeasement was not something which bad people, dishonest people carried out, but well-meaning people who did not recognize their adversary. That is, adversaries, Hitler or Stalin, were nothing like gentlemen. Now, what this message of President Valenza brings back, particularly for me, these great years and great hopes what we had in the early 90s. Just recall, it was said that we should have democracy from Vancouver to Vladivostok. Europe whole and free. These were slogans which I think not simply what many of us, perhaps most people in Europe or in most good people in the world hoped for, but there was a chance it would continue and it would realize. What went wrong? Well, on the one hand, we can see that the message of the past, the message of, as I said, how to deal with dictators was more or less forgotten. Again, with the best intentions. But if I want to find a culprit, somebody who is, or a country which is responsible for this bad turn of events, it would be Russia. In the 90s, people now speak about short-lived American hegemony. But I think it was not a Pax Americana, but rather a Pax Democratica, and God forbid it should not be Pax Russica. Well, as a Hungarian, I may be considered to be biased against the Russians. In the mid-19th century, Russia suppressed Hungary's war for independence. I was 15 during the 1956 revolution, and I will certainly not forget the feeling when, on November the 4th, I woke up to the sound of Russian guns and knew that all our hopes of the last 2 weeks are gone. But I always emphasized that it was not the Russian people who were really suppressing us. It was a Tsarist system and especially a communist system. And the greatest victims of communism were two people, the Russians and the Ukrainians. Now, in the 90s, there was Yeltsin's Russia. Well, we know of the shortcomings of Yeltsin, but I think, and I met him and talked to him, he meant really seriously that he wanted to turn Russia into a multi-party democracy. And even more, his foreign minister, Kosyryev. But then, perhaps that is the biggest mistake Yeltsin made, was to nominate a successor that was Putin. But even Putin started in a different line, especially after 9/11. He spoke very kind of warmly and understandably about the tragedy which has befallen upon America. So the future historians will rather ask who lost Russia. I think it is Putin who lost a democratic, prosperous Russia. Now, what is the future like? What is likely? Well, first of all, the optimistic scenario, and I think we should be optimistic because that is a guideline. If we are optimistic and can follow it up, we have a better chance to realize these hopes. So, a few hours earlier, the question was raised whether Russia could be defeated. And I think I was one of the few who said yes, but I have to qualify that. I don't mean that Russia can be or should be defeated in the sense that the Ukrainian flag should fly on the Kremlin. Not at all. But what Russia wants, and Putin made it very clear, for provinces of Ukraine to be annexed to Ukraine, and even the rump Ukraine should be something like a new Belarus. So in fact, if we follow those people who say that, well, there should be an immediate ceasefire followed by peace talks, well, immediate ceasefire would still fall short of Putin's avowed aims. But what would it be? It would be really a defeat for international law, a defeat for the very promise Russia in 1994 made actually in Budapest, at the CSE conference. So in fact, Russia should be contained, not defeated, contained, well, hopefully beyond its legitimate internationally recognized borders, and that would mean also that Ukraine should return. Now, some people say that there might be a quid pro, then if Ukraine occupies Russian territory, then the Russians may give up what they have occupied. Well, the proportions are not sufficient for that. But finally, if the world follows the example or the advice of many people of vision, and Mr. Sokor this morning spoke very emphatically that yes, it is in the power of the West, of the democracies, to contain Russia, not to defeat Russia, to contain. And that is the only future for a democratic world. And to turn to a bad scenario, what would happen if Putin would prevail? Well, most of us here say that, well, then the danger will become even more serious. Yes, some people say that, well, Putin is sensible enough. He will never attack NATO, a NATO country. Well, let us hope it will not certainly happen, but the best way to prevent it is to help Ukraine to stand this assault and to recover as much territory as possible. Well, if it does not happen, then we will be back to a pre-Second World War situation. Europe disunited. Yes, the European Union may continue, but it would be a defeat for the Europe. It would be even a defeat for NATO, and certainly a defeat for the United States. And now it is not a conflict which some people, especially Putin and his friends, say that it is really a conflict between the United States and Russia, and the two can come to an agreement. No, it is a fight between democracy, the free world, and the dictatorships. So the consequences of a Russian success would be extremely dangerous, threatening all of us, and especially our children and grandchildren.
Thank you so much, and particularly for the historical context to help us understand the current situation even better. Mr. Kurtyka, your take on this worst case to best case scenario.
Thank you very much, Olga. Thank you, Reka, for inviting Minister of Climate, simple engineer among such distinguished panel members. So I will join on the historical and geopolitical perspective that you just presented in order to go a little bit maybe deeper to these issues and maybe name things in a little bit different manner, but completely in line with what you said both. So first, let me say that interestingly, energy has become one of the most important foreign affairs tools. And when you, Mr. Hakkonen, you mentioned why we didn't act in 2014, I recall Poland alerting its allies constantly since at least 20 years that there is a growing danger because Russia is using its energy as a proxy for war. And so we were confronted with consequent problems with energy gas supplies. 2009 it touched all the region, but then why I'm saying this one? 2021, in the autumn 2021, I had the privilege of being Polish minister responsible for energy, and so we were observing rising gas prices all across Europe. And as we have quite a good teams for energy and for gas in particular, because what that was one of the issues, bone of contention between Poland and Russia. So we analyzed and we were unable to find a market reason for such a jump. So I came to Brussels and I said, colleagues, there is something going on. I don't understand what. And I was, again, a Minister of Energy and Climate. I wouldn't imagine a war. So I was saying there is something going on, it's not normal. And my colleagues in Brussels, well, they were very much reluctant to hear. And then they said, okay, we will analyze this. They sent it to a small team within European Commission. 3 weeks later, they said there is nothing happening. Well, we know right now that Russians were preparing to suffocate Europe by not providing it with gas. So they were expecting exactly the Crimea scenario, that they jump into the airport of Kiev, Jeszenszky is dead, there is some kind of puppet president getting in, the gas is turned off. Well, all this would have worked if the Ukrainians were not making their homework. If Jeszenszky we didn't appear to be such a strong political and charismatic leader, and if we didn't have American LNG. Because my thesis is that we would have abandoned Ukraine on the eve of the 23rd of February if shale revolution didn't happen. Because we wouldn't be able to heat our houses, we wouldn't be able to light our houses, and we know that gas is, technically speaking, setting the price of electricity in Europe. So if you have skyrocketing gas prices, even if it's not the major part of our consumption, still it is determining the energy prices. So energy is at the heart, but I right now come back to your question. And very briefly, what is the worst, maybe what is the worst case scenario? Well, I think it's a frozen conflict in which Russia has time to rebuild its resources and Ukraine feels lost by its allies. Because then we have everything what you already mentioned, Minister, the political changes within European Union, within our countries, elections, etc., will bring also a couple of people doubting about the necessity to support Ukraine. Russia will come back with its corrupting political scene in our countries. So that is the worst case scenario. Now I come back to the best case scenario, and I think it was perfectly described as accepting one word. I would like this word to be a little bit heard better. It's I think that Russia is the last empire. And I would even go a little bit more farther. It's a zombie empire. It's an empire which was killed in 1991, and still it is rebuilding with Putin. So when you can imagine a horror movie of zombies, we have this kind of zombie coming back to the region and saying, hello, I'm an empire, I'm back, I would like, by the way, to kill you. Well, all other empires historically disappeared during the 20th century. And you mentioned also 1939. I like this very much. We are in September 1939. Somehow historically we were able to say that German Nazis were responsible for the Second World War. Yes, but they were equally responsible together with Stalin Russia, Soviet Union. On the 17th of September 1939, we will soon celebrate another anniversary of this, we had Russians who invaded Poland. And obviously then history turned a little bit, and so they appeared to be victorious, but still it was an empire, and all other empires disappeared, especially Germany, Nazi Germany, imperialist Japan were transformed in a manner which is completely unrecognizable right now in terms of if we compare what's going on with societies, yes? So we can expect also a democratic Russia. We can expect to have friends in Russia. But we need to somehow take this imperialist couvercle, if I may say, out of their minds. So my best case scenario would be Russia collapses. And Russian imperialism is dead, and the history is moving as it moved with other empires, and we can foresee this decolonialism movement also for the Russian Empire.
Thank you for painting such a vivid picture for us. I think we can all see it. Well, you kind of got ahead of some of these really interesting questions that are already coming in, which is great. And some of them, I love it because some of them are, controversial, really pushing kind of the boundaries of where should we direct this discussion. So this question is from the audience, and it is on, should the West make an effort to destabilize the Putin regime? And you kind of touched on it a little bit towards the end of your comments, but we'll start over here. So this is, a pretty big question here. Is this something that the Western allies should consider?
But this is maybe first reaction to what you, Michael, said in your interesting introduction. You were dreaming of the collapse of Russia, and I think in Finland, at least, when we looked Prigozhin midsummer march towards Moscow, we were thinking that if this guy has tomorrow the nuclear button, we are in totally a new world, and that would be certainly a collapse of Putin's Russia in its way, but we can have many kinds of collapses, and we have to be very careful what we wish for on these collapses, because country with the nuclear weapons and nuclear arsenal has to be somehow managed, and that's maybe also part of the discussion when we think about the Russia really collapsing into many bits and pieces. What could be the worst and good scenarios? I think we have to be very careful on that. But of course, I think the key issue is that Putin's regime and all regimes that will follow it should learn their lessons from Ukraine, that attacking a neighboring country is not profitable, and you cannot gain anything with that, and we have to increase the price of that attack as much as we can, and not only support Ukraine, but also to make it very expensive for Russia in the form of the compensations and others for the damage that caused by Russia.
Do you want to contribute? Go ahead.
Many people think that after all, Putin has a point, that Ukraine is a neighbor, a close neighbor, and Ukraine being or becoming a member of NATO would be a threat to Russia. Well, my answer is that a country neighboring Russia, as member of NATO, is not a threat to Russia, but in fact it is very beneficial. First of all, I think that Norway, since the beginning of NATO, has been a neighbor to Russia. After the great changes, the Baltic states, Poland has become neighbors and members of NATO, and Turkey has long been also a NATO member. So in fact, if these countries, being members of NATO, do not represent a threat, why Ukraine would be a threat? And as I said, it is just the contrary, because Russia needs stable and prosperous neighbors. We have to admit that Ukraine was very far from being a stable and prosperous country. But in fact, this war gives Ukraine a chance. If and once Ukraine prevails in its, as I said, not by defeating the Russians, in that case we have a very good chance that given the goodwill of the world, reconstruction will probably be rather quick, of course requiring huge amounts of money, and that is a question I cannot answer where the money would come, or particularly whether how we can compel Russia to pay reparations. Certainly, reparations are due to Ukraine. But the question really is that what would be a best course to prevent Russia starting a new war? And not only an armistice or even a peace conference or a peace treaty. We can see that Russia, presently Russia, is not keeping its word, is not keeping its pledges. But if Russia is really closed by EU countries and NATO countries, including Georgia, then I think sensible people in Russia must or will wake up. Putin is very unlikely to wake up, but after all, on the long run, Putin will not be with the world. And then perhaps a kind of victory or defeat for Russia would speed up the chances that Russia will become would have a different, better leader. Of course, many people say that just the opposite, and there may be people worse leaders than Putin. It is hard to believe, and very lately I have just come to think that, well, we, especially Hungarians, Czechs, Poles, thought that Brezhnev was a terrible Soviet leader. But compared to Putin, Brezhnev was after a sensible person, and he did not want to change the borders. He did not want to defeat the, well, perhaps he wanted to defeat the West, but was realistic enough not to think about it. And yes, Putin has such aims which really represent a threat. So I think that is something which public opinion should bear in mind. Not enough for the leaders, but of course the leaders should be leading the public, and the public is, not necessarily strong enough right now on this war, but with good leadership and with the arguments reaching, and not the Soviet or Russian propaganda, then we have a good chance that sensible Europeans will follow the good leaders and follow the policies which we all advocate.
Thank you. Michał, I feel like we kind of already know your answer, but go ahead.
No, I wouldn't give an easy answer right now, Olga. So I don't think we should that much be, let's say, proactive in a sense of meddling inside Russia, because I would consider it to be quite dangerous. On the contrary, I would rather believe forces of history. And forces of history are eliminating empires. This is what happened in the 20th century. And why couldn't it end up with the Russian Empire? To the greatest benefit of Russian people. Because when you mentioned Prigozhin, well, what was striking with Prigozhin march, it was a complete indifference of the population. And what we notice also for the Kursk offensive, do you see massive patriotic engagement of Russians in Kursk? I don't see. They are completely put in the corner. They have been in mental prisons. And if we help them actually get rid of Putin-alike autocrats which will govern them from Moscow, then I think we will help 100 million decent people to live a good life. And if we don't do it, when we can ask ourselves our responsibility, because that would be obviously bad for neighbors, that would be at some point keeping this this imperialist system close to our frontiers. But I think again that would be important for Russian people also to be able to wake up in a completely different world. And the argument of the nuclear button, I think it is a word, an argument which is supposed to kill any discussion about Russian collapsing and dismantling of the empire. Well, it happened already. In 1990 or 89, depending how we count, Russia was disintegrated into several nuclear powers. At that time, Ukraine and Kazakhstan were nuclear powers. So it already happened. Obviously, this time it will be different because Russia is not anymore a multi-ethnic in the same manner as it was. It's much more monolithical, especially the western part. But still, when you look inside, Prigozhin and Wagner that you mentioned, it's not the only private army in Russia right now. All of them right now are militarizing railways, Rosatom, Gazprom has its own battalions, etc. So it might not be a war, a collapse in a sense of we understand it as another people's revolution, but it might be very well a war for resources.
Thank you so much. We have a question here in the front row. Vladimir, why don't you introduce yourself and pose the question?
Vladimir Sokol from the Jamestown Foundation. A number of analysts in Washington and in Europe expect that it might be possible to freeze, at least temporarily, the war in Ukraine. I expect that Russia will deny us that option. The notion of freezing a conflict is as relative as the notions of peace and war in the age of hybrid conflict, which I referenced in my presentation in the morning panel. There is no such thing anymore as a frozen conflict. Russia claimed to freeze the conflict in 2014-2015 as a result of the Minsk agreements, and instead it confronted Ukraine and ourselves with 7 years of low-intensity warfare punctuated by high-intensity phases. So that was no frozen conflict, although the West did expect a frozen conflict. Similarly, in Georgia, Russia froze the conflict in the 1990s, then unfroze it in 2008 and gobbled up Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Russia will not freeze the conflict in Ukraine. It will continue the conflict for the purpose of creating the appearance of continuing war to block Ukraine's admission into NATO on the basis that Ukraine is a country at war. So we should not count on the freeze of the conflict in Ukraine. It would be something completely different from a freeze. Thank you.
Thank you, Vladimir. Any responses to this, or do we just nod? Any additional thoughts to this? Please.
Just actually one comment on the earlier issue, which was about the meddling in Russian issues. My grandfather, when he was 17, he escaped from the school 1920 and wanted to free Russia. He participated to this kind of Aunus movement when Finns went over the border, the Russian side, and wanted to give freedom to people in Eastern Karelia and so forth. But it wasn't a very successful trip, and when my grandfather came back, he was asked at how it was, and he said, well, I was more eager to free these Eastern Karelians than they were eager to have the freedom. And that's the heritage in our family, that, you know, when you go over border, it maybe doesn't bring a very good results. And I fully agree that this has to be an internal Russian process. We can certainly support the opposition, we have to host opposition here and so forth, but this democratization of Russia has to be a Russian project in the end of the day, and we have to do our utmost, of course, to help these democratic forces. And there was already reference made to Yeltsin time and so forth, or Gorbachev time, however you want to describe it, and I'm against that kind of thinking that Russia is hopeless. I think that's also spreading quite a lot even in my own country, that Russia is always the same. It's hopeless. You cannot influence. There will no be any good developments in the country. And I think we have witnessed many periods. I don't maybe praise Brezhnev period so much because of the civil liberties were very limited, but we have seen many kinds of Russia actually during the last 100 years, and that gives me some hope that we can see also other kind of Russia in the future.
Thank you, please.
Well, on this last point, I would say that yes, we all hope for a different Russia, but very sadly, those people who would be able to bring about the change are leaving Russia, escaping Russia. I don't know how many millions have left. So it requires something very spectacular to wake up the Russian people. And perhaps one item may be to make them thinking about China. On this panel we have not mentioned so far, but talking about scenarios, if Russia, Putin prevails, that would be also something which would encourage or which would induce China to continue or to follow the example. So Taiwan problem would become very acute in that case. On the other hand, if Putin's plan and scheme fails, then I suppose China will also behave in a different way. And we should not forget that right now, we discussed it, I think it was yesterday, that there is a marriage of convenience between Russia and China. And some people pointed out very rightly, Mr. Matura, I think, that after all, these two countries on the long run are almost bound, if not to fight, but at least to have a conflict, especially in view of the depopulation of Siberia and the Chinese large number of people who are densely populated areas. So in fact, this conflict, the outcome of the Ukrainian situation has significance far beyond Europe. It has significance on these Chinese plans and Chinese hopes to become, to overtake the United States. So here again, the stakes are enormous, and the future of the world seems to hinge upon the outcome of this present war.
Thank you. Michał, did you want to contribute?
I agree with everything, so it's easy.
I love that, and thank you, Vladimir, for your intervention. I think the Crimean population, particularly the minority Crimean Tatar population, would very much agree with you that there was really nothing was really frozen about that, especially those people who were tortured and still are imprisoned or were displaced from their homes. So thank you for that point. So a couple of different directions we can take this. China was brought up, and we actually have a question on China. So kind of asking about, Russian threat versus Chinese threat. And then let me just add on quickly to this. The narrative that, you have to pick one or the other. You hear that narrative from some voices, even in the United States, that you kind of, you have limited resources, you have to pick one, China or Russia, that you want to focus on containing. And there are some voices that are really pushing and saying, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can do both. We can't afford not to do both. Let's go this way for once. Michał, which camp are you in? Can we do both, and not just U.S., but all Western allies and others who are engaged in China and Russia developments?
Well, I think the nature of the problem is different, because also nature of Chinese and Russian, let's say, external objectives is quite different. But because of this, how they called it, strategic partnership between Xi and Putin, the one which was built just before the Olympics, I would tend to think that Xi must have been informed of Ukraine before. And so, in a way, all you described regarding Taiwan is here particularly true. And I see our Japanese friends, South Korean friends, Australian friends who are extremely interested in what's going on in Ukraine. Well, we as Europeans, we should also see what's going on the other side of Eurasia. And it's funny when a Pole is going to Japan or China, because the only country which is between Poland and China, or well, South Korea, I don't know exactly, but I think nearby is one. There is only one country between. Yes. So what will happen to Russia will be extremely impactful on these relations.
Mr. Jeszenszky.
Well, I would mention an idea which unfortunately is spreading in Hungary from high above, namely that the future belongs to China, and the sensible policy for a small country like Hungary, and perhaps other countries as well, is to be close to China and perhaps to become the first satellite of China. Well, of course, this is totally unacceptable for millions of Hungarians if they start to think about that. But one argument or against this threat that you also mentioned, that China has its own problems, not simply Taiwanese, perhaps the problem of the Taiwanese, but all the neighbors of China are afraid, and they are very sensibly stick together. So that is also a kind of guarantee. And again, back to Ukraine, if this war ends in a fair way, good terms, then it will be also more likely that China, who are after all very sensible, very intelligent people, will abandon such plans, as we can see in the South China Sea, to dominate in one way or another its own neighborhood. So again, as I had said already, how important it is, what we will see in the coming weeks, God forbid, years.
Thank you so much. Mr. Haavisto?
Well, first I agree what has been said, and of course it has been interesting to see around the NATO table, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand and others. It's really widening the security issue. One that combines, of course, Russia and China is to speak for the multipolar world and not world dominated by the West or by the US alone and so forth. And so there they have a common interest. But I'm again changing a little bit the picture by some of the experience from the African continent. I was the European Union Special Envoy in Sudan and Darfur, and of course China was extremely and has been extremely active in that region. And one time I asked from the Sudanese minister that what kind of elevator speech China has when it's entered to a country like Sudan. And the minister said it's very simple. They have 3 points. First they say, we had a population growth problem in China during 1970s, and everybody said you cannot cope with that problem. But then we managed, we had a population plan and others. If you have any population problems here in Africa, we have a solution from China. Then everybody said during 1990s that you are doomed to have a very bad economy in China, but we have this yearly growth 5 to 6%, so if you have any economic problems here in Africa, China has a solution. And now people say that we cannot cope with our ecological problems, but we happen to have the cheapest wind turbines and cheapest solar panels, so if you have any ecological problems here in Africa, China has a solution. So this is how China markets itself on African continent. What can you offer? What's your offer to Africa? And I have to say that it's not so clear always what we can offer and what is our, how can we compete with this Chinese influence. And I can see China is all over, it's in Hungary, it's on Western Balkans and so forth. But we have to be, actually, we have to face all these problems that other continents have and really compete with China and make a better offer, and it's our task.
Just one point I may add. Again, given my age, I remember very well Comrade Mao and his idea that how to defeat the West, how to defeat democracy. to surround it. So the countryside it will prevail over the town. And to some degree, we can see, under the Cold War, during the Cold War, the so-called Third World was a kind of a target of the Soviet Union and becoming very active in Africa. So nowadays, we can see Russia is very active. Not only China is active, but Russia too in Africa. Prigozhin is just one example. So that also shows that the necessity to be a united front of all democratic inclined countries, including India, and India is sometimes called the largest democracy of the world. So I think we have to hope that India will be also a partner to counter the aggressive plans of its neighbors, whether it is Russia or China.
You were referring to Comrade Mao Zedong, and when I was in China, of course, there are still huge pictures of Mao. And one time I asked from my guide from the parliament in Beijing that, can I be a Maoist in China? And he said, definitely not, you will be put to jail. And I said, well, but you have the big Mao pictures here. Yeah, but you cannot be Maoist in this country. And then I asked, what's the difference? He said that, Mao wanted exactly this, the development of the countryside and so forth, but we have decided to start with the towns and cities. So you cannot be Maoist.
Any additional thoughts on China?
Maybe just one comment. I think that China has achieved a technological superiority in a number of subjects, and especially manufacturing capabilities of China are right now absolutely amazing, especially in the energy field, the one that you mentioned. So the challenge is very different, I think, for Europe, for US also, on China, related with the challenge of completely different nature for the moment, related with Russia. But there is one, I think, a little bit a common point. You mentioned Hungary. Hungary is right now a big consumer of Chinese money, but I think that there is no free lunch, as we say in economics, and there is no free money from China. It does not exist. And the same, if I may come back to my subject, because nobody was talking about energy except that I tried a little bit. There is no such a thing as cheap energy from Russia. And I'm saying this because Mario Draghi report, which was published this week in Brussels, Mario Draghi used the term that we are a little bit in trouble in Europe because there is no more cheap energy from Russia. Well, the challenge is that this cheap energy was not cheap when you combine it with the cost of corrupting your political system and economic behaviors. And by the way, that is also the challenge, because China is exporting not only its money, but also its political system and way of dealing between politics and business. So we should be aware of free, let's say, gifts.
Thank you so much. Another good question. I think there's actually two questions in here, so let me read this out and then we'll dissect it. Why do you think the West refuses to accept the fact that the geopolitical status and the future will depend on the outcome of the Russia-Ukraine war? And the reason why I say there's two questions is, there's an assumption. Do you agree that there's a refusal in the West to accept how significant it is for West's geopolitical status on how the war progresses? And then do you think that that is the situation? Do you think that there is denial in terms of how the weight of this war and its development and how this will hurt West's reputation in the future, Western reputation in the future? Whoever wants to take that on.
Well, I think West understands it. I have not seen this kind of unity into the European Union earlier, but of course the big question is that how far our voters, our taxpayers understand it. I'm now referring to German elections, for example, and so forth. And I've been discussing, of course, a lot with the German ministers and German government on the issue, German support to Ukraine, and they have been the biggest supporter. But they don't get the credit out of that. They don't get the credit in their own country, and they don't get the credit internationally. We all the time say what Germans should do more, but we haven't seen the sentence that they already are the biggest one. And this is where the politicians also come to their limits. If your people don't get the credit that they are using taxpayers' money for these and these purposes, then there easily come this kind of war fatigue situation and so forth. And it's we have to repeat the reasons as politicians why we are doing that and what is the basis of our intervention. And also actually the whole legality issue that all the UN rules are violated, all the warfare rules are violated. You have to come again and again with this argumentation, and I think that's the responsibility of us decision makers to clarify to our voters and our taxpayers and so forth why this is so important.
I would pass it because I have another question which I would like to raise, but perhaps you have something. And if I may,
Please.
We can see that Putin used a kind of pretext on attacking Ukraine, saying that, well, the Russian speakers in Ukraine are suppressed terribly. Well, there may have been mistakes, or probably there were mistakes committed by the young Ukrainian national feeling, thinking that, well, if they can make every Ukrainian citizen speak Ukrainian rather than Russian or rather Hungarian, then everything will be fine. But I think we have to deal with this kind of threat or the danger of using a pretext, basically a false pretext, because first of all, the Russian speakers in Ukraine, some of them may have had a strong Russian kind of national identity, but most of them did not. They were Russian speakers, but many of them now consider themselves genuinely Ukrainian. And especially, you could see that Putin expected to be welcomed by these eastern inhabitants of Ukraine, and it did not happen, just the contrary. And who suffer most under the war? It is these eastern territories, the Russian-speaking territories. And yes, we Hungarians had and have our concern for a very small, about now only 100,000 Hungarians in Ukraine. But here too, if an authoritarian Belarus type of Ukraine would be the outcome of the conflict, it would be very bad for the Hungarian minority in Ukraine as well, because it would be under an oppressive system, and we could see what happened under the Soviet Union, how many people disappeared. Robert Conquest's book, The Nation Killers, yes, Stalin and his empire was a nation killer. So a democratic Ukraine, which is almost guaranteed if Ukraine really wants to join the European Union, then that is the best guarantee for maintaining and honoring the rights of national minorities and various languages by the minorities. So in fact, Hungary, besides Hungary, Romania, and to a lesser degree, Poland is also interested in having Ukraine, a democracy, who follows all the commitments made, soft law, unfortunately, by the Council of Europe. So in fact, that outcome of the conflict has also implications beyond Ukraine, again, how the problem of national minorities will be treated in the future.
Thank you so much. And I think it depends on the day when you ask Putin of why. One day it's to protect minorities, one day it's for protect language, the other day it's NATO, another day every day he's got a new excuse why. But the democratic body and function and foundation of Ukraine is extremely important. And what you said earlier in terms of how this war actually helped shape Ukraine's identity and bring people together, I think is really, really, really important to note as well. But also noting hundreds of years of Russian oppression of Ukrainian language and Ukrainian culture to, I think, provide some context. So a lot of really important things all coming together. Like, we only have a few minutes left. So I want to bring us back to the beginning of the conversation when we kind of talked and took a big question of best case, worst case scenarios, and a few of you mentioned words like containing Russia, or what does it look like to defeat Russia? Is there a pathway to victory? What does that even look like? I think we all agreed on a scenario where Ukraine gets its internationally recognized territory back. Some of you mentioned that could be the best case, a possible scenario. Different opinions on how realistic or unrealistic that is. But I think the question that we haven't found consensus on is, how do you enforce any kind of agreement with Russia, a country that has, and Putin, who has refused to comply, who refuse to respect any of the existing agreements out there. I mean, Russia is supposed to be providing security guarantees to Ukraine right now. It's just the irony of it is, it would be funny if it wasn't so horrific. So how do you enforce these guarantees, any kind of agreement that does get signed, whether it's fully supported by Ukraine or Ukraine is forced into that agreement? How do you enforce it? And then you mentioned something in the beginning where you said, joining NATO is the only way to enforce any kind of agreement with Russia. Do you agree or disagree? Are there other ways to enforce any kind of agreement, any kind of peace outside of NATO membership?
Let me first say that I fully agree with the minority language issue, and including the Hungarian language. This has been the topic that we have been taking also up with the Ukrainian regime, that it's unnecessary conflict or unnecessary tension that they are raising with this issue, with your Hungarian language. But, well, it looks like the membership of European Union is very obvious, and hopefully the NATO membership will follow. And of course we all know the obstacles on that way, but it's clear that Ukraine needs also at the negotiation phase international security guarantees. And there are a couple of countries that can give those security guarantees. US definitely is needed, big European powers is needed. If we see someday an agreement where China, India are part of course, that would mean something on the international community. I think that's the way to go, but of course to get to that situation means a moment when Russia also analyzes that they cannot get more on the front, they cannot get more on the fighting, and they are hopefully on the loser's side. And this is of course where we are trying to aim at with all our military support to Ukraine. But we all know that, it cannot be freezed conflict, it cannot be a conflict continuing forever. Also Ukraine has its limitations when you think the population, how much you can mobilize in this case, and so forth. So we hopefully get there with our action. Of course, we also see that in the many conflicts, black swans appeared. Something happens that nobody has been calculating. I was thinking at some moment that a nuclear accident could be very likely when you are fighting close to the nuclear power plant, which changes the whole dynamic of the war. So something like that can also happen.
I remember when I was received by President Valenza in 1993, we spoke obviously about Russia a lot, and there is this common kind of theme that Russia is the bear. And Valenza said that yes, we have to put the bear safely into a cage. Well, it may sound unfair, and yes, it is not pleasant to be whether a bear or a person to be behind a cage, but yes, containment, I think, is a word and a policy which once worked even against Stalin. So containment is not rollback and not liberation, as we understood. So in fact, the bear can be really treated, if well treated. Once the bear behaves, then it is promising. And I recall a front page the mid-80s, late 80s, from The Economist. The Russian bear is on the front pages. The question was whether a wealthy bear will be a cuddly bear. So the big question really, whether a prosperous Russia would be by nature a democratic Russia. About China, this policy did not work after all. But after all, China is not really prosperous on the large scale, only on the surface. So I think with good policies, Russia can be well handled, and also a friendly policy can be pursued, but Russia must give up its present policies.
Thank you. Michał, just a few seconds left.
Thank you. 20 seconds for me. The word nuclear has been mentioned. I think a lesson which we do not focus enough of this conflict is the fact that Russian military is being beaten in the field like nobody expected it. And still everybody is afraid about Russia. Why? Because Russia has nukes. So the biggest lesson learned for every autocrat in the world is if I have my nukes, nobody will attack me. And that is a very dangerous lesson, because that has been heard all across the globe. And I come back to the question of Ukraine being denying its nuclear heritage. Well, we can ask ourselves the question at that time whether they had the control of the nuclear baton, whether it was not in Russia, etc., etc. But still, physically, they detained the missiles. And if today we had the same kind of discussion and the war was happening between nuclear Ukraine and nuclear Russia, I'm not sure whether Russians would be in such a belligerent spirit as they are. But that's not only a lesson for Ukraine, that's not only a lesson for NATO stability, and especially in Central Europe, but that's, I'm afraid, also a lessons learned of this conflict all across the globe.
Thank you so much. I think we had some very vivid images during this panel. We had a cuddly bear, a caged bear. We had some imperialistic zombies. So I'm really grateful for this panel, for your expertise. Please give it up for our speakers.